If you walk into Stanford's Memorial Church today, you'd never guess what happened there. It's gorgeous. Light coming through stained glass, tourists taking quiet photos, students ducking in between classes. It feels like the kind of place your grandma would love on a campus tour. But if you rewind a few decades, that same building was at the center of one of the strangest, darkest stories to ever come out of Stanford. Not because of a haunting, or a legend, or a rumor, but because of something very real that happened there one night and then sat unsolved for more than 40 years. This is not a story that starts in a sketchy bar or a random parking lot. It starts in the place you're told is safe when everything else feels heavy, a church, and not some anonymous neighborhood chapel, a massive showpiece church in the middle of one of the most famous universities in the country. Here's the basic setup, and I want you to hold it in your head as we go. One young woman, one locked church, one October night in 1974. No sign of forced entry, no arrest, for 44 years. That's it. That's the whole core of the case. And because that gap between we know something terrible happened and we don't know who did it stayed open for so long, people did what people always do. They started filling in the blanks with whatever scared them most. By the late 70s and 80s, we were deep in what everyone now calls the Satanic Panic. Talk shows were obsessed with cults. Paperbacks promised true stories of ritual crime. Parents were told there were dark networks operating just out of sight. So when a young religious woman was killed in a locked church and the crime scene looked staged, with religious objects moved around her, it was like handing that era its perfect nightmare. Facts got drowned out by feelings and far-out claims. Suddenly, it wasn't just a murder at Stanford. It was a ritual killing, a satanic murder. People claimed it was tied to cults, to cross-country networks, even to David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Killer, because he scribbled her name into his own weird mythology years later. There was almost no hard evidence behind those theories, but they didn't need it. They sounded good. They sold books. They made for creepy late-night TV segments and eventually endless YouTube thumbnails. Meanwhile, the actual case was just sitting. Physical evidence boxed up. A short list of people who had keys. Detectives aging out and retiring. A family who had to go home without answers while strangers on the other side of the country turned their daughter's death into a campfire story. That's really the split this case lives in. On one side, you've got the internet version. Cults, satanic symbols, secret connections to other murders. On the other, you've got a real person who walked into a church to pray and never walked back out. Somewhere between those two is what actually happened. So in this video, we're not just going to chase the wildest theory. We're going to slow down and do three things. Start with who she actually was before she became a case. Walk through what we actually know about that night. Look at how, decades later, DNA quietly blew up a lot of the mythology and pointed back to someone who'd been in the story from the very beginning. And then we're going to talk about us, about the way we consume stories like this, about what we owe real people when we turn their lives into content, and about why sometimes the boring truth is more disturbing than the wildest conspiracy. So let's go back to the beginning. On an October night in 1974, a 19-year-old newlywed walked into Stanford's Memorial Church to pray. By sunrise, she was dead. The doors were locked. The church was supposed to be empty. Her body was found near the altar in a scene that was clearly staged, with religious objects arranged around her and signs of a brutal attack that investigators would later call one of the most disturbing of their careers. For 44 years, no one was arrested. In that silence, the story twisted into something bigger than one crime. Rumors of cults, satanic rituals, even supposed links to the Son of Sam murders. A real person's death slowly turned into a campus ghost story and a true crime urban legend. Then, in 2018, everything shifted. Advances in DNA testing finally unlocked what the original investigation couldn't. Evidence preserved from 1974 pointed back to a man who'd been in the story from day one, the campus security guard who said he'd discovered the body. When detectives arrived at his home with a warrant, he retreated into another room and died by suicide before they could take him into custody. With that, the case was officially declared solved. But without a trial, a confession, or clear answers to some of the most haunting questions. So yes, this is a story about a murder in a locked church. But it's also a story about how we turn victims into myths, how institutions handle evil when it appears in their most sacred spaces, and what gets remembered or rewritten when a case becomes legend. Before she was a headline or a forum thread, Arlis Perry was a person. Born in 1955 in Bismarck, North Dakota, she grew up in a tight-knit religious community. Friends and family remember her as kind, reserved, and quietly devoted to her faith. Her world, at first, was small in the best way. Church on Sundays, familiar faces at school, the same streets and seasons repeating year after year. People who knew her talk about someone who took her beliefs seriously, but never pushed them on anyone. Someone steady, thoughtful, and sincere. In 1974, she married her high school boyfriend, Bruce Perry. He got into Stanford. She followed him to California as a 19-year-old newlywed, taking a receptionist job in Palo Alto and trying to build a life thousands of miles from home. Imagine that shift for a second, from North Dakota to one of the most prestigious universities in the country in the middle of the 1970s. Stanford was a place of protest, experimentation, and big ideas. For Arlis, it was also a place where she knew almost no one, carrying a very grounded Midwestern faith into a culture that couldn't have felt more different. She wasn't a symbol or a stereotype. She was a teenager in a new place, trying to balance a serious faith with a very human, ordinary life on a world-famous campus that couldn't have felt further from North Dakota. She missed home. She wrote letters. She was newly married, figuring out how to be an adult alongside someone who was also trying to find his footing. On the night she died, she and Bruce had a small, everyday disagreement. Nothing dramatic. One of those normal arguments couples have when they're tired and stressed. Some accounts say it was about something as mundane as car tire pressure. It wasn't a relationship-ending fight. It was just life. Arlis decided to walk to Memorial Church to pray and clear her head. For her, that wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was who she was. When she was upset, she went to the place that felt most familiar and grounding, church. She didn't go to a party or a bar or someone else's room. She went to a church that stood at the heart of Stanford. Huge stained glass windows, murals, and rows of pews that gave you the sense that, whatever was happening outside, this was a safe place. Memorial Church wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of the campus itself, a kind of architectural spine that anchored the university. During the day, it was full of light, tourists, students, and services. At night, it quieted down to something almost cavernous, echoing footsteps, muted colors, the air a little cooler and still. Witnesses later remembered seeing her inside, sitting quietly in a pew close to closing time. As far as anyone could tell, she was doing exactly what she told her husband she'd do, taking her worries to church and planning to go home afterward. When she still wasn't back in the early hours of the morning, Bruce called campus security. It's one of those moments that's easier to think about in hindsight than it is to live through in real time. At first, you assume someone's just running late. Then you notice the time. Then there's a knot in your stomach you can't quite explain. A check from outside showed the church doors locked. There was no sign of forced entry. Officers didn't break in. They left, assuming no one was inside, and that she had gone somewhere else or would turn up soon. Around dawn, security opened the church for the day. That's when Arlis was found near the altar. The scene was immediately clear. This wasn't an accident or a medical emergency. The attack had been violent, and the way her body and nearby items were arranged suggested someone wanted to send a message. Investigators quickly understood that they were dealing with a homicide in one of the most visible, supposedly secure buildings on campus. They collected what evidence they could: fingerprints, biological traces, physical items. But this was 1974. DNA profiling didn't exist yet. They were working with tools that, by today's standards, feel blunt. Still, they did what they could. They mapped the scene, took photographs, interviewed staff and students, and looked closely at anyone who had keys or late-night access to the church. The list of people who could have locked themselves in with Arlis was limited. The case drew attention immediately. A young woman, newly married, killed in a locked church at one of America's top universities. That alone was enough to shock people. Parents of students worried. Local newspapers covered it closely. Stanford had a tragedy in the building that was supposed to represent its highest ideals, but the deliberate staging added another layer, one that felt almost theatrical. There were religious objects involved. The positioning was precise enough that it was impossible to see it as random. Faced with that, detectives floated the idea that there might be some kind of ritual or symbolic motive. Media coverage picked up that angle and amplified it. Over time, as the case stayed unsolved, possible ritual elements morphed into satanic murder in headlines and retellings. From that point on, there were really two stories playing out at the same time. One was the quieter, painstaking work inside the case file. Who had motive? Who had opportunity? What the physical evidence actually showed. The other was the louder, more dramatic version in the public imagination. A ritual killing in a church, possibly linked to something much bigger and darker. The official investigation kept working through more grounded questions. Who had access to the church? Who had keys? Who knew the building well enough to control the space and the timing? The same names appeared again and again, including the security guard who reported finding Arlis. He was interviewed. There were inconsistencies, but inconsistencies are not the same thing as proof. And without modern forensics, nothing they had felt strong enough to secure a conviction. Leads faded. Officers transferred or retired. Evidence went into storage. Arlis's family went home without answers. Outside those files, though, the story took on a life of its own. Over the late 1970s and 1980s, America was deep into what people now call the Satanic Panic. A period where rumors of cults and ritual crimes spread quickly, often far beyond the actual evidence. Arlis's case had all the ingredients people were primed to fixate on: a church, religious symbolism, a young Christian woman, and an unknown killer. Talk shows and tabloids loved stories that hinted at secret societies, dark rituals, and conspiracies lurking just beneath the surface of normal life. true crime paperbacks used phrases like sacrilege and ritual murder on their covers. Even if they didn't have concrete proof, the implication was enough to captivate people. Writers and independent investigators tied her death to larger theories about cult networks. One high-profile true crime book suggested she might have been targeted by occult groups she'd tried to confront or convert back in North Dakota, then followed to Stanford. There was no solid evidence to back that narrative, but it was compelling. Even more fuel came from the Son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz. In a book sent to North Dakota authorities, he scribbled a note referencing Arlis by name and implying she'd been hunted and followed to California. It wasn't backed by hard evidence, but for people already convinced there was a secret web of cult activity, it was enough to cement the idea that her case was part of something bigger. Police did speak to Berkowitz, but nothing concrete came out of it. Officially, there was still no verified link between Arlis's murder and any wider network or other serial cases. Unofficially, the myths spread anyway. As the years went on, her story popped up in books, documentaries, podcasts, and countless online videos. Titles leaned into the darkest angle: Stanford's satanic murder, the ritual killing in the church, the Arlis Perry cult connection. Some creators approached it carefully, focusing on the known facts and clearly separating evidence from speculation. Others treated the case like a puzzle piece in a much larger, ominous picture, stacking what-ifs on top of what-ifs until Arlis was almost unrecognizable compared to the person her family knew. And that's where the ethical question creeps in. At what point does trying to solve a mystery or tell a story cross the line into treating someone's real death as entertainment? For more than 4 decades, the reality that there was preserved physical evidence and a finite list of people with access took a back seat to the biggest, most cinematic theories. Meanwhile, the actual case file waited for science to catch up. When it finally did, it changed everything. By the 2000s, DNA testing was advanced enough to pull individual profiles from material that would have been useless in the 1970s. Cold case investigators re-examined the evidence collected from Arlis's clothing and the scene and sent key items for modern analysis. The results pointed to someone who had been in the story all along: security guard Stephen Crawford, the man who had unlocked the church that morning and reported finding her body. By then, he was in his 70s, living in a modest apartment in San Jose. He'd already had run-ins with the law over stolen items from Stanford, which included some deeply unsettling things for someone who had once been trusted with campus security. It painted a picture of a man who had been collecting things he shouldn't have had, moving in the gray area between authority and obsession. In June 2018, deputies went to his home with a warrant. This was the moment investigators had been waiting on for decades, the chance to confront their suspect with hard science behind them, and maybe finally get the full story of what happened in Memorial Church. They knocked. They identified themselves. Crawford stepped away into another room. Moments later, a single shot rang out. He had taken his own life before they could arrest him. Later that day, officials held a press conference and named him as Arlis Perry's killer. They cited the DNA match and his long-standing position as a prime suspect. They described his actions as cold and calculated and said they believed the case was, in effect, solved. For Arlis's family, and for people who had followed the case for decades, it was a moment of whiplash. After all the talk of cults and conspiracies and cross-country networks, the answer was a man with keys, a man who had been trusted, a man who had been right there from the start, But solved doesn't always feel like closure. We don't get a courtroom, we don't get sworn testimony, and we don't get to hear him explain what happened inside that church. The most important answers: why Arlis? Why that night? What exactly unfolded between her arriving to pray and her being found at dawn, died with him? So what does this case actually tell us? It shows how quickly our minds reach for the largest, most dramatic explanation when something feels too awful to comprehend. A staged murder in a church naturally pushed people toward talk of cults, rituals, and grand conspiracies. It shows the limits of safe spaces. Memorial Church was supposed to be a sanctuary at the heart of a prestigious campus, protected by locks and security. But all of that depends on who holds the keys. When someone in a position of trust decides to abuse that power, the illusion of safety can vanish in a single night. And it shows the tension at the heart of true crime itself. For decades, Arlis's story has been told, retold, and dissected by people who never knew her. Some raised awareness and kept the case alive. Others leaned so hard into the most sensational angles that the real person at the center of it almost disappeared. If her story means anything now, maybe it's this: remember that behind every mystery is a human being whose life didn't start with their last night. Understand that even the safest seeming institutions can fail to protect the people inside them. And be careful about the narratives we build on top of real people's pain, especially when the truth, one man abusing access and walking free for decades, is already horrifying enough. If you want more deep dives that focus on both the facts of a case and the culture that grows up around it, let me know which one you'd want to hear next, and how you think stories like this should be told. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.